Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today we are diving into one of the most expressive forms of writing, that is poetry. So whether you are a fan of Shakespeare's sonnets or lost into the woods of epics or driven by the or intrigued by the modern spoken word, poetry has something for everyone else, right? So today we are going to learn what poetry is and different types of poetry. So let's explore the poetry together. So first we should know what a poetry is. So at its core, poetry is a form of literary expression that uses language, structure, meter, rhythm, and often rhyme to convey ideas, thoughts, or emotions. So, unlike a regular speech or a prose, poetry plays with sounds and structures to create some rhythm and depth. So, poetry can be abstract or straightforward, it can be concise or it can be sprawling, but poetry is used to create emotions in human beings, or poetry creates emotions and different kind of thoughts in human beings that feels unique to the reader or to the listener. So poetry evokes emotions in us in depth. So now we are going to learn about different types of poetry. So first we are going to learn about lyric poetry. So, lyric poetry expresses personal emotions or thoughts typically from a single speaker. It's short, melodic, and often in the first person. So, if we talk about the examples, think of sonnets by Shakespeare or the emotional verse of Emily Dickinson. So, these are the examples of lyric poetry. If we talk about the key characteristics of lyric poetry, how we are going to know that it is a lyric poetry. So, lyric poetry is often associated with musicality, using sound devices like rhyme, meter, and alliteration. So, here I have given an example of lyric poetry. You can see the Shakespeare sonnets, so it is a lyric poetry. So now we are going to learn about narrative poetry. So narrative poetry tells a story, often with characters, a plot, and a setting. So it's like a short story but in verse form. So we can see that the examples of narrative poetry are some famous examples that includes Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, and the famous work of Coleridge, that is the Rime of Ancient Mariner. So we know that in the Rime of Ancient Mariner, the mariner was describing his experience but in a verse form. So that's why it is known as the narrative poetry. So what is the importance of narrative poetry? So narrative poetry kinds of gives the poets the chance to explore epic themes like heroism, adventure, and morality. So here is an example of narrative poetry. I have shown you a snippet from the Coleridge, The Ancient Mariner, the Rime of Ancient Mariner. You can see that it is written in the form of narrative poetry. So next we are going to learn about the epic poetry. So epic poetry is a long narrative poem that focuses on the deeds of heroic figures and often reflects the values of a society. So some of the famous examples of epic poetry are Beowulf, the Aeneid, John Milton's Paradise Lost, and we can say that Mahabharata is the greatest epic of all the time. So now you know what a epic is. So some of the key themes of the epic poetry, how we are going to know that this is the epic poetry, that epic poems often explores the themes of good versus evil, human fate, and divine intervention. So these are the themes of epic poetry. So you know the famous work Mahabharata. So it is a form of epic poetry. So next we are going to learn about haiku. So haiku is a form of poetry that is traditional Japanese form of poetry. So it consists of 3 lines with a 5-7-5 syllable structure. So a famous example of haiku was that we know Matsubaso is one of the most famous haiku poets. So his work often captures nature and the human experience in a minimalist way. And why the haiku is considered as a unique form of poetry? Because despite its brevity, a haiku captures deep emotions and images within just a few words. So here I have presented an example of haiku. Please refer to it. So next we are going to learn about the free verse. So free verse poetry does not follow any specific rules or rhyme or meter. It allows the poet to break free from this traditional structure that a poetry must follow. So one of the best examples of free verse is Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass and many Langston Hughes works that uses free verse to express some deep and personal themes. Why the free verse is so popular? So the flexibility of free verse makes it a favorite among the modern poets, and it allows them to experiment with language and form. So here I have presented a example of free verse poetry. You can refer to this for your future writings as some modern poets. All right. So next we are going to learn about the sonnet. So a sonnet is a 14-line poem that is written in iambic pentameter style. So it often deals with themes like love, time and beauty. So we know, as for example, we know that Shakespeare was a famous sonnet writer. So for this sonnet, we can refer to Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 or some Petrarchan sonnets. So, what is the structure of the sonnet? How should we know that it is a sonnet? So, the English sonnet uses an A B A B C D C D E F E F G G rhyme scheme, while the Italian sonnet follows a more complex pattern. So, as you can see that in this stanza, I have presented a sonnet from which I have gotten stanza, and you can see that in the structure I said to you is presented here. Next, we are going to learn about ode. So, an ode is a form of lyrical poetry that praises something or someone, often in a formal or elevated tone. So, the ode was used to praise an event or someone or something. So, the famous examples of an ode, we can say that Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to Psyche, and Shelley's Ode to West Wind. These are the famous examples of odes. So, odes are used to reflect on and to celebrate the beauty of nature, emotions, or some abstract ideas. Here you can see that this is a famous example of ode, that is Ode to Nightingale by John Keats. And in this poem, in this ode, we can see that Keats was praising the nightingale, its songs, and its immortal theme. Next, we are going to learn about elegy. So, an elegy is a mournful or reflective poem that typically written in remembrance of someone who has already died. So, some of the famous examples of elegy was Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. So, what is the purpose or tone behind the elegy? So, elegies are often melancholic, that it meditate on death, loss, and the fleeting nature of life. So, I have presented a example of an elegy. You can refer to this and you can write your own elegy. So next we are going to learn about limerick. So limerick is often known as a humorous, often nonsensical five-line poem with a specific rhythm, that is A rhyme scheme. It is presented in the form of in the structure or in the format of A rhyme scheme. One of the most notable poet of limerick form of writing was Edward Lear. We can refer to some of the works or poems of Edward Lear to know what a limerick was. So now we are going to learn about villanelle. So villanelle is a 19-line poem that consists of 5 tercets, that is followed by a quatrain with some specific repeating lines and a rhyme scheme. One of the famous example of villanelle was a poem written by Dylan Thomas, that is, "Do not go gentle into that good night." Some other notable poets of villanelle form of writing or form of poetry was Dylan Thomas, Sylvia Plath, and many more. So you can refer to the poems of Sylvia Plath or Dylan Thomas to know what a villanelle is. Now we will be learning about sestina, that is a different kind of writing of poetry. So sestina is a complex form of poetry with 6 stanzas of 6 lines each, followed by 3-line envoi, where the end words of each line follow a set of particular pattern. So we can see that Ezra Pound, Elizabeth Bishop, they have used this form of poetry, that is sestina, to create some good poems. So we can refer to the poems of Ezra Pound or Elizabeth Bishop to know what the form of writing that sestina is. Next, we will be learning about acrostic. So, acrostic is a poem in which the first letter of each line spells out a word or a message or the alphabet. One of the famous poet, that is Edgar Allan Poe, has written in the format of acrostic writing. So we can refer to a poem written by or composed by Edgar Allan Poe to know what kind of format acrostic form of writing follows. Next, we are going to learn what concrete poetry was. So, concrete poetry is a kind of poetry in which the arrangement of words on the page forms a visual image that is important to the poem's meaning. So, we can refer to the work of George Herbert's Easter Wings to know what a concrete poetry is. So today we have covered several types of poetry, from the structured sonnet to the free-flowing verse, each with its own unique features. So which type of poetry is your favorite? Please let me know in the comment section below, and do not forget to subscribe for more content on literature. Bye everyone, see you all in the next video.